I was 63 years old when they started filming me without my knowledge, laughing as they zoomed in on my sensible walking shoes and the way I squinted at the self-checkout screen. What they didn't know was that I owned the building they were standing in, and by the time I was finished with them, their credit scores would be lower than my blood pressure medication dosage. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Beulah Carter, and for 37 years I ran Carter's Corner Market in downtown Millbrook. It wasn't the fanciest place, just a small grocery store with squeaky floors and fluorescent lights that hummed too loud. But it was mine. I'd inherited it from my father when I was 26, fresh out of business school, and full of ideas about modernizing everything. Over the decades, I'd watched the neighborhood change around me, seen families grow up buying their milk and bread from my shelves, witnessed the slow transformation from a working-class community to something altogether different. The gentrification happened gradually, then all at once. First came the coffee shop that charged $5 for what used to cost 50 cents at my counter. Then the boutique selling $100 candles right next door to Mrs. Patterson's laundromat, where people had been washing their clothes for 40 years. The young professionals moved in with their sleek cars and designer workout clothes, and suddenly my little market felt like a relic from another era. I didn't mind the change, not really. Business was actually better than it had been in years. These new residents had money to spend, and they appreciated the convenience of walking to get their groceries instead of driving to the big chains out by the highway. I started stocking organic produce, fancy cheeses, craft beer, and those expensive sparkling waters that came in glass bottles. My profit margins improved, and for the first time in decades, I wasn't worried about making rent on the building. That's the part of the story most people didn't know, and certainly not the group of 20-somethings who would eventually make me the unwitting star of their social media content. When my father passed, he didn't just leave me the store, he left me the entire 3-story building that housed it. The store occupied the ground floor, and I rented out the apartments upstairs to help with expenses. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady income, and over the years I'd paid off the mortgage entirely. The building was worth more now than my father could have ever imagined, sitting right in the heart of what real estate agents were calling Millbrook's most desirable neighborhood. I lived alone in the apartment directly above the store, a cozy 2-bedroom space with windows that looked out over the main street. I'd never married, never had children, and while that sometimes felt lonely, it also meant I had the freedom to run my business exactly how I wanted. I knew every regular customer by name, remembered their preferences, and often extended credit to families going through tough times. It was old-fashioned maybe, but it worked. The trouble started on a Tuesday in March when 3 young people walked into my store. I recognized the type immediately. Carefully disheveled hair, expensive sneakers, clothes that looked thrifted but probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget. They were part of the new wave of residents, the ones who treated the neighborhood like their personal playground. I'd seen them before, usually in groups, always talking loudly and taking photos of everything like they'd discovered some hidden gem instead of a place where real people had been living and working for generations. The tall one with the perfectly messy brown hair picked up a basket and started shopping, but something felt off about the way they moved through the store. The shorter girl with the nose ring kept glancing at her phone and giggling, while the third one, a guy with an elaborate beard and vintage band t-shirt, seemed more interested in looking around than actually buying anything. I continued organizing the magazine rack near the counter, keeping one eye on them as they wandered the aisles. That's when I noticed the phones. All 3 of them were holding their devices at odd angles, pointing them in my direction while pretending to read ingredient labels or examine produce. The girl with the nose ring was definitely recording something, barely concealing her laughter as she zoomed in on me struggling to reach a box of cereal on a high shelf. I'm not a tall woman, never have been, and at my age, I wasn't about to climb on chairs just to make things easier for myself. I used the small step stool I kept behind the counter for exactly this purpose. They found this hilarious. I watched them exchange glances and heard fragments of whispered commentary. Something about vintage vibes and so authentic, and this is perfect content. The tall one with the brown hair approached the counter with a single energy drink and a bag of chips, placing them down while maintaining eye contact with his phone, which was clearly recording our interaction. "Will that be?" I asked politely, the same way I'd greeted thousands of customers over the decades. "Yeah, just these," he said, but his voice had that performative quality people use when they know they're being recorded. Too loud, too enunciated, like he was speaking to an audience rather than to me. I rang up his items and told him the total. He handed me a $20 bill, then seemed to hesitate, drawing out the transaction longer than necessary. "This place is so cool," he said, looking around with exaggerated appreciation. "Like, it's so retro. Very authentic neighborhood vibes." "Thank you," I replied, though something about his tone made the compliment feel backhanded. As I counted out his change, I noticed the other two were still filming, now not even trying to hide it. The girl with the nose ring had her phone pointed directly at me, and I could see myself on her screen, looking exactly like what I was, a 63-year-old woman in comfortable clothes and sensible shoes, doing her job. "Could you maybe not film in my store?" I asked quietly, trying to keep my voice friendly but firm. The girl looked up with wide, innocent eyes. "Oh, we're not filming anything bad. We just think this place is so charming, like stepping back in time. I'd prefer if you didn't." I repeat, "It's actually totally legal to film in public spaces," the bearded one chimed in, not looking up from whatever he was recording. "Just so you know." I felt heat rise in my cheeks. "This isn't a public space. This is my store." "Right. But it's open to the public," the tall one said, pocketing his change. "So technically." They left without finishing the explanation, but not before the girl with the nose ring made sure to get one more shot of me, standing behind my counter, probably looking as frustrated as I felt. I watched them cluster on the sidewalk outside, phones still out, talking animatedly and occasionally glancing back through my window. I tried to put the incident out of my mind. Young people had always been inconsiderate, and social media had just given them new ways to express it. I'd dealt with difficult customers before. This was probably nothing more than some silly video they'd post and forget about within a week. I was wrong. 3 days later, Mrs. Patterson from the laundromat stopped by during her lunch break, looking "Beulah, honey, have you seen what they're saying about you online?" I hadn't. I owned a smartphone, but I used it mainly for calls and text messages. I had a Facebook account that I checked maybe once a week, usually to see photos of my grandnieces that my sister posted from Florida. The world of TikTok and Instagram, and whatever other platforms these young people used, might as well have been foreign countries to me. "What are they saying?" I asked, though I had a sinking feeling I already knew. Miss Patterson, Aldar her phone, tapped and swiped for a moment, then turned the screen toward me. "My daughter sent me this, said it was going viral." The video was only 15 seconds long, but it felt like an eternity. It showed me from behind, reaching for that box of cereal, my gray hair pulled back in its usual practical bun, my cardigan slightly wrinkled from a long day of work. The audio had been edited to add some kind of old-timey music, the kind you'd hear in a movie about the 1950s, and text had been overlaid on the image. POV, "You time traveled to 1953 and the grocery store owner hasn't been updated yet." The comments were worse than the video itself, hundreds of them, all making jokes about my appearance, my age, the way I moved. Someone had written, "She looks like she still uses a rotary phone," followed by laughing emojis. Another said, "Bet she asks for help finding the electronic mail on her computer." There were references to my vintage aesthetic, and jokes about whether I accepted payment in old-timey coins. But the comment that really stung was from the original poster, the girl with the nose ring, whose username was Millbrook Babe. She'd written, "This sweet old lady runs the cutest little store in our neighborhood. Total time capsule vibes." She got so pressed when we were filming though. Like, "Ma'am, This is 2024. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Not 1924. The video had been viewed over 50,000 times. "I'm sorry, honey," Miss Patterson said, taking her phone back. "Some people just don't have any respect." I thanked her for showing me, but spent the rest of the day feeling like everyone who walked into my store was looking at me differently. Had they seen the video? Were they laughing at me too? When a customer asked where I kept the olive oil, I found myself wondering if they were making mental notes about my outdated way of organizing the shelves. That evening, I sat in my apartment above the store, staring at my own phone. I'd managed to find the video myself, along with several others that had been posted over the past few days. Apparently, my store had become some kind of destination for these content creators. They called it aesthetic shopping and vintage vibes, but the underlying message was clear. I was a relic, a curiosity, something to be pointed at and laughed about with friends. One video showed me carefully counting change for an elderly customer, with text that read, "When the ancient cashier has to count on her fingers because calculators haven't been invented yet." Another featured my handwritten sale signs, which I'd always been proud of for their neat lettering and clear pricing. The caption called them adorable analog energy, and included hashtags like old school and before computers. The worst one was a compilation. Someone had stitched together clips from multiple visits, showing me doing ordinary things, restocking shelves, helping customers, adjusting my glasses to read a price tag. They'd added a filter that made everything look sepia-toned and played music that sounded like it belonged in a museum exhibit about the early 20th century. The final text overlay read, "Local time traveler refuses to enter the modern era. Someone please show her what a smartphone is." I'd lived through the civil rights movement, the rise of personal computers, the invention of the internet, and countless other changes that had transformed the world beyond recognition. I'd adapted my business to accept credit cards, installed a modern point-of-sale system, and even set up online ordering during the pandemic. But to these people, I was just an old woman who didn't understand technology, a convenient prop for their entertainment. The videos kept coming. Every few days, there would be a new one, often featuring the same group of people but sometimes including others who'd apparently been inspired to visit my store specifically to create content. They filmed me from behind, from the side, sometimes from across the street, through my window. They recorded me talking to customers, reaching for items, even sweeping the floor at the end of the day. I started to dread going to work, which was something I'd never experienced in nearly 4 decades of running the store. I found myself second-guessing every movement, wondering if someone was filming, trying to look more modern or youthful, or whatever it was they wanted me to be. I considered asking them to stop, but the last time I'd tried that, it had only resulted in more mockery. The breaking point came 3 weeks later, on a Saturday morning that started like any other. I was arranging fresh flowers in the window display, something I'd done every weekend for years because it made the store feel more welcoming. It was a small pleasure, choosing colors that complemented the season, and creating arrangements that would catch the eye of people walking by. The same 3 people from that first day returned, but this time they brought friends. 6 of them total, all in their 20s, all holding phones, all barely containing their excitement at whatever content they were planning to create. They entered my store like they owned it, spreading out to different aisles and immediately beginning to film. I tried to continue my work, but it was impossible to ignore them. They were loud, commenting on everything they saw, clearly performing for their cameras rather than shopping. The bearded one picked up a can of green beans and said, "Oh wow, look at this vintage packaging. It's like completely retro." The green beans were from this year. I'd stocked them the previous Tuesday. The girl with the nose ring, a Millbrook babe, was filming herself examining my handmade price tags, with exaggerated fascination. "You guys, look at this handwriting. It's like actual calligraphy." She probably learned this in school before computers existed. I was 59 when I bought my first computer. I'd taught myself to use spreadsheet software to manage inventory, and had been accepting electronic payments since they became available. But correcting them would only give them more content, so I stayed quiet and continued arranging flowers. That's when I heard one of the new additions to their group, a young man with bleached hair and an expensive camera, say something that made my blood run cold. "This is perfect," he whispered to the others, but not quietly enough. "My management company has been looking for exactly this kind of authentic content. If we can get her to sign a release, we could use this footage in our campaign for the neighborhood development project." The neighborhood development project. I knew exactly what he was talking about, though I'd tried not to think about it too much. A real estate development company had been buying up properties throughout Millbrook, promising to revitalize the area with modern mixed-use buildings that would house retail spaces and luxury apartments. Several of my fellow business owners had already sold, seduced by offers that seemed too good to refuse. The company, Pinnacle Urban Development, had approached me 6 months earlier. A smooth-talking representative named David Kellner had sat in my store explaining how my building would be perfect for their vision of a modern retail experience that honored the neighborhood's historic charm. He'd thrown around numbers that made my head spin, offering to buy the building for nearly 3 times what I'd estimated it was worth. I'd turned him down, not because the money wasn't tempting, but because this store was my life's work. It was my father's legacy, and my daily purpose. I couldn't imagine starting over somewhere else, and I certainly didn't want to see the building torn down or transformed into something unrecognizable. But now, listening to this young man talk about management companies and development projects, I realized there might be more to these viral videos than simple mockery. If they could paint me as an out-of-touch relic standing in the way of progress, public opinion might shift in favor of development. People might start to see my refusal to sell as selfish or backward thinking. The pieces started falling into place. The coordinated nature of the way they always seemed to film the same angles, focusing on anything that looked old or outdated, the hashtags that emphasized how behind the times everything was. This wasn't just random content creation. This was a campaign. I continued arranging flowers, but my hands were shaking slightly now, not from age or weakness, but from anger. They weren't just making fun of me, they were trying to undermine my business and my reputation to serve someone else's agenda. The blonde one with the camera was still filming, now narrating a tour of my store like it was a museum exhibit. "And here we have the ancient cash register, probably from the Carter administration." The Carter administration. Get it? Because that's her name on the sign outside. They all didn't. "Oh, and look at this," the girl with the nose ring said, pointing her phone at my bulletin board where I posted community announcements, lost pet flyers and advertisements for local services. She still uses actual paper to share information. Like instead of posting online, she just puts paper on a wall. It's so charmingly primitive. I'd had enough, not just of the filming, not just of the mockery, but of the dawning realization that I was being manipulated by people who saw me as an obstacle to their financial interests. I set down the flowers I'd been arranging and walked to the counter, where I kept a small notebook I used for taking inventory notes. I started writing down names, descriptions, and everything I could remember about these visits. The times, the faces, the comments about management companies and development projects. If this was part of a larger campaign against me, I was going to need documentation. The blonde one noticed me writing and nudged his friends. "Guys, look, she's taking notes, with an actual pen, on actual paper." More laughter, more filming, more content for whatever agenda they were pushing. But I kept writing, because while they saw an old woman struggling to keep up with modern times, I saw something else entirely. I saw people who had no idea who they were dealing with. They thought I was helpless, clueless, easily intimidated. They thought my age made me weak. They were about to learn how wrong they were. After they left, I locked the front door and flipped the sign to closed, even though it was only mid-afternoon on a Saturday. I climbed the stairs to my apartment and sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, the one I'd bought 3 years ago when my old computer finally gave up. It wasn't the newest model, but it worked fine for my needs, and right now, my needs included doing some research. I started with the obvious, looking up at Millbrook Babe and the other usernames I'd managed to spot on their phones. Their profiles were public, full of content about their fabulous lives in authentic Millbrook designer clothes posed against brick walls, artfully arranged coffee cups from the expensive cafe down the street, group photos at trendy restaurants that had opened in former auto repair shops and family-owned diners. But it was the tagged locations and mutual connections that told the real story. Several of them worked for companies connected to real estate and marketing. The blonde one with the camera listed his employer as Creative Content Solutions, which took me to a website advertising services for reputation management and community engagement strategies. I'd been in business long enough to understand what that meant. These weren't just random young people making fun of an old lady, they were professionals, hired to create a narrative. I spent the next hour digging deeper, following connections between the people who'd been filming in my store, and the various companies involved in Millbrook's development. The web was more complicated than I'd expected, involving multiple LLCs, marketing firms, and consulting groups, but the pattern was clear. Pinnacle Urban Development was paying for content that made existing businesses look outdated and problematic. They wanted to create a story about neighborhood improvement, about bringing Millbrook into the modern era, and people like me were cast as obstacles to progress. The more I learned, the angrier I became, not just at the deception but at the arrogance. They thought I was too old and too naive to figure out what they were doing. They thought they could turn me into a laughingstock and I'd never connect it to their larger agenda, but I had advantages they didn't know about. I'd been in this neighborhood for decades. I knew every business owner, every longtime resident, every person who'd been here since before gentrification became a buzzword. I had relationships. These young content creators couldn't access an information they couldn't find on the internet. More importantly, I had something they needed, my building. They could make all the viral videos they wanted, but at the end of the day, I owned the property they coveted. I held the keys to their development plans, whether they realized it or not. That evening, I made 3 phone calls that would change everything. The first was to my accountant, Margaret Chen, who'd been managing my finances for 15 years. Margaret was sharp, thorough, and had helped me navigate the complexities of property ownership and small business management through 2 recessions and countless regulatory changes. "Bilula," she said when she answered. "What's going on? You sound upset." I explained the situation, from the viral videos to the development connections I'd discovered. Margaret listened without interruption, occasionally making small sounds of understanding or disapproval. "You're right to be concerned," she said when I finished. "This kind of coordinated campaign isn't uncommon in areas targeted for development. They want to control the narrative before they make their next move." What kind of move? Could be anything. Maybe they'll try a more aggressive buyout offer. Maybe they'll start complaining to the city about code violations or zoning issues. The goal is usually to make resistance look unreasonable. Margaret agreed to review my financial records and property documentation, making sure everything was properly protected. She also suggested I consider hiring a lawyer, just to be prepared for whatever came next. The second call was to my nephew Danny, my sister's youngest son who worked in cybersecurity for a tech company in Seattle. Danny was 34, smart as a whip, and had always been patient with my occasional technology questions. "Aunt Bilula," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "What's up? Please tell me you didn't forget your email password again." I explained the situation, including the viral videos and my suspicions about coordinated harassment. Danny's tone changed as I talked, becoming more serious and professional. "Send me all the links," he said. "Usernames, profile information, anything you can find. I'll do some digging from my end." "What kind of digging?" "Let's just say these content creators probably aren't as anonymous as they think they are. People who use the internet for business purposes leave digital footprints, and those footprints can tell us a lot about who's really behind this." Danny promised to have information for me within 48 hours. The third call was the most important, and also the most difficult. I called my old friend Jim Morrison, who'd retired the previous year after 30 years as a federal investigator specializing in financial crime. Jim and I had known each other since high school, And while we'd lost touch for a few decades, we'd reconnected at our 40th reunion and had stayed in contact ever since. Beulah Carter, he said when he picked up. This is a nice surprise. How are you holding up? I told him everything. The videos, the harassment, the connections to development companies, my suspicions about coordinated campaigns. Jim listened with the kind of focused attention that comes from years of investigating complicated cases. You know, he said slowly when I finished, what you're describing sounds like it could involve several different types of fraud. If these people are being paid to create defamatory content without disclosing their financial relationships, that's potential wire fraud. If they're targeting you specifically to pressure you into selling property, that could be extortion. But how would I prove any of that? One step at a time. First, we need to document every video, every interaction, every connection you can establish between the content creators and the development company. Then we look for financial records, payment trails, anything that shows coordination. Jim offered to make some unofficial inquiries, reaching out to contacts who might be able to help gather information. He warned me that building a case would take time, but assured me that what I was describing was definitely worth investigating. After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen as the sun set outside my windows, feeling something I hadn't experienced in weeks. Hope, not just hope that the harassment would stop, but hope that these people would face consequences for what they were doing. They thought they were dealing with a helpless old woman who didn't understand the modern world. They were about to discover that age brings advantages they couldn't comprehend: patience, experience, and a network of relationships built over decades of treating people with respect. I opened my laptop and started typing. If they wanted to document everything about my life and business, I would return the favor. Every face, every username, every comment and connection I could identify. I had time, and I had motivation, and I was about to show them exactly how much damage a determined woman could do with nothing more than persistence and the truth. The next morning, I reopened my store as usual, but everything felt different. Instead of dreading the possibility of being filmed, I found myself hoping they would come back. I had started carrying a small notebook in my apron pocket, ready to document every interaction. I'd also positioned my own phone discreetly near the cash register, set to record video whenever I needed it. I didn't have to wait long. Around noon, two of the regular content creators showed up. The bearded one, and a girl I hadn't seen before, someone with carefully curled hair and a designer purse that probably cost more than most of my customers spent on groceries in a month. They were more subdued than usual, perhaps sensing that something had changed, but they still filmed everything. The bearded one recorded himself examining my produce section while providing commentary about authentic neighborhood markets and pre-corporate shopping experience. I served them politely, rang up their purchases efficiently, and made careful notes about everything they said and did. When the new girl tried to engage me in conversation about how long I'd been running the store, I answered her questions directly while observing how she positioned her phone to capture my responses. 37 years, I told her. It's been a wonderful way to serve the community. That's so amazing, she gushed, in a tone that suggested she found it more quaint than amazing. You must have seen so many changes in the neighborhood. I have, I agreed. Some good, some not so good. They left after making their purchases, but not before the bearded one made sure to film the exterior of my building, panning from the store sign up to the windows of the apartments above. That particular detail went into my notebook with a star next to it. That afternoon, Danny called with preliminary findings from his digital investigation. Aunt Beulah, you were right to be suspicious, he said. These aren't just random content creators. At least 3 of the accounts targeting your store are connected to marketing companies that specialize in grassroots engagement for real estate clients. He explained how he'd traced IP addresses, analyzed posting patterns, and cross-referenced social media data with business registration records. The picture that emerged was exactly what I'd suspected: a coordinated campaign designed to shape public opinion about my neighborhood and my business. The really interesting part, Danny continued, is that some of these accounts started posting about Millbrook development projects months before they ever filmed in your store. They were already part of the narrative before you became a target. Can you prove they're being... That's harder, but I found some evidence. Several of the accounts have payment processing links that trace back to shell companies. I'm still working on connecting those to Pinnacle Urban Development, but the pattern is pretty clear. Danny sent me a detailed report with screenshots, network diagrams, and financial connections. It was more information than I could fully understand, but it painted a clear picture of deliberate manipulation. Margaret called that evening with her own findings. She'd reviewed my property records and discovered several interesting facts that I'd either forgotten or never fully understood. Beulah, do you realize your building sits on what's considered a key parcel for the Pinnacle Development Project? According to the city planning documents I found, they can't move forward with Phase 2 of their project without acquiring your property. I hadn't realized that. I'd known they wanted my building, but I'd assumed it was just one of many properties they were trying to accumulate. There's more, Margaret continued. I looked into Pinnacle's financing structure, and they're operating on some very tight timelines. They have investors expecting returns on specific schedules, and delays can trigger penalty clauses that cost them serious money. What does that mean for me? It means your refusal to sell isn't just inconvenient for them, it's potentially very expensive. If they can't acquire your property by their projected timeline, they could lose millions in investor commitments. The implications were staggering. These viral videos weren't just mean-spirited pranks, they were part of a calculated effort to pressure me into selling by damaging my reputation and making my business seem outdated and unwelcome in the changing neighborhood. But now I understood something they probably didn't expect me to figure out. I held more power in this situation than they did. They needed my property more than I needed their approval. On Wednesday morning, Jim called with the most encouraging news yet. Beulah, I've been talking to some colleagues who specialize in this kind of case, and we think you've got the foundation for a solid complaint. The coordination between the content creators and the development company, combined with the targeted harassment and the financial pressure tactics, adds up to what we call a pattern of racketeering. Racketeering? That sounds serious. It is serious. RICO violations carry significant penalties, both civil and criminal. If we can prove that Pinnacle Urban Development orchestrated this campaign to pressure you into selling your property, they could face federal charges. Jim explained that building a RICO case required demonstrating a pattern of illegal activity designed to achieve specific financial goals. The viral videos, the coordinated harassment, and the connection to the development project could constitute exactly that kind of pattern. What do I need to do? Keep documenting everything. Save every video, every comment, every interaction. My contacts are preparing to open a preliminary investigation, but they'll need comprehensive evidence to move forward. That afternoon, I did something I'd never done before in nearly 4 decades of running my store. I closed early and drove to the city planning office. If Pinnacle Urban Developments thought they could manipulate me through social media harassment, I wanted to understand exactly what they were trying to achieve. The planning office was located in a bland government building downtown, filled with the kind of fluorescent lighting and beige carpeting that made everything look slightly depressing. But the clerk who helped me, a middle-aged woman named Sandra, was friendly and efficient. I'd like to see the public records for the Pinnacle Urban Development Project in Millbrook, I told her. Sandra pulled up the files on her computer and printed out dozens of pages of documents, zoning applications, environmental impact studies, architectural renderings, and financial projections. As I reviewed them, the scope of Pinnacle's plans became clear. They weren't just planning to build a few modern apartments and retail spaces. They were proposing a complete transformation of 6 city blocks, including the entire street where my store was located. The project included luxury condominiums, upscale shopping, a boutique hotel, and what they called a curated dining experience. My building was marked on their maps as Parcel 7A, Key Acquisition. According to the timeline, they needed to acquire and demolish my property by September in order to break ground on schedule. It was currently March, but the most interesting part was buried in the financial documentation. Pinnacle had secured funding based on specific projections about property acquisition costs and timelines. If they couldn't meet their targets, they would face penalties that increased dramatically with each month of delay. I photographed every relevant page with my phone, thanked Sandra for her help, and drove home with a much clearer understanding of what I was up against. That evening, I called a meeting, not with lawyers or investigators, but with my fellow business owners along the street. If Pinnacle was targeting me specifically, I suspected they might be pressuring others as well. We met at Rosa's Cafe, the family-owned restaurant 3 doors down from my store. Rosa Hernandez had been serving authentic Mexican food to the neighborhood for 22 years, and her dining room had hosted countless community meetings over the decades. 8 business owners showed up: Rosa, Tom from the hardware store, Miss Patterson from the laundromat, David, who ran the small electronics repair shop, Carmen from the beauty salon, old Mr. Wu from the Chinese restaurant, Sarah, who owned the bookstore, and Mike from the auto repair garage at the end of the block. "I think we're all being targeted," I told them, explaining what I'd discovered about the viral video campaign and its connections to Pinnacle Urban Development. The reaction was immediate and intense. Several of them had experienced similar harassment, though none quite as systematic as what I'd endured. "Those kids have been coming into my restaurant too," Rosa said, "always filming everything, making jokes about the decor. Last week one of them posted a video calling my tamales authentically vintage Mexican food, like it was some kind of museum exhibit." Tom nodded vigorously. "They filmed my tool display and made jokes about how I still organize things by hand instead of using computer." Got over 10,000 views. Mrs. Patterson had been dealing with content creators who found her vintage washing machines hilarious. "They act like I'm some kind of historical reenactor instead of a business owner trying to serve my customer." As we compared experiences, the pattern became undeniable. Every business on our block had been targeted by the same group of content creators, always with the same themes. We were outdated, quaint, charmingly behind the times. The message was consistent. These businesses didn't belong in a modern neighborhood. "So what do we do about it?" Sarah asked. I pulled out the stack of planning documents I'd collected that afternoon and spread them across Rosa's largest table. "We fight back, but not the way they expect." Over the next 2 hours, we developed a strategy that was part legal defense, part public relations campaign, and part old-fashioned community organizing. If Pinnacle Urban Development wanted to play games with social media and public opinion, we would show them what real community engagement looked like. Our plan had 3 components. First, we would document everything, just as I'd been doing, but in a coordinated way that captured the full scope of the harassment campaign. Second, we would use our own networks to tell our side of the story, reaching out to longtime customers, community leaders, and local media to counter the narrative being pushed by the viral video. Third, we would research and expose the financial connections between the content creators and the development company. "These kids think they invented community," Rosa said with a laugh. "They don't realize we've been building one here for decades." By the time we left Rosa's Cafe that night, I felt something I hadn't experienced since this whole situation began. I wasn't alone. These people understood what was at stake, and they were ready to fight for it. But I still had one more card to play, one that none of them knew about yet. Because while Pinnacle Urban Development had been busy orchestrating social media campaigns and pressuring business owners, I'd been quietly making preparations of my own. The meeting at Rosa's Cafe had energized me in a way I hadn't felt in months, but as I climbed the stairs to my apartment that night, I knew the real work was just beginning. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea and opened my laptop, ready to put our collective plan into action. The first order of business was expanding my documentation system. If we were going to build a case against Pinnacle Urban Development, we needed more than just my notebook full of observations. We needed a comprehensive record that could stand up in court. I created a shared digital folder that all the business owners could access, dividing it into sections for each type of evidence we were collecting. Screenshots of social media posts, photographs of the content creators in our stores, recordings of conversations where they revealed their true purposes, and financial documents showing the connections between the harassment campaign and the development company. Danny had taught me how to use cloud storage during one of his visits last Christmas, and now that knowledge was proving invaluable. Within days, our shared folder was filled with evidence that painted a clear picture of coordinated target. Rosa contributed videos of the content creators in her restaurant, including one particularly damning recording where they discussed how their vintage Mexican food content was performing well with their gentrification audience. Tom from the hardware store had managed to photograph business cards that fell out of one creator's wallet, revealing connections to marketing firms we'd already identified. Ms. Patterson proved to be surprisingly tech-savvy, creating detailed spreadsheets that tracked posting patterns, engagement metrics, and cross-platform content sharing. She'd discovered that many of the viral videos about our businesses were being promoted through paid advertising, something that required significant financial backing, but the most valuable contributions came from Sarah at the bookstore. As someone who'd worked in journalism before opening her shop, she knew how to research corporate structures and financial relationships. She'd spent hours digging through business registration databases, SEC filings, and property records, mapping out the web of companies connected to Pinnacle Urban Development. "It's more complicated than we initially thought," she explained during our second meeting, held in the back room of her bookstore surrounded by towers of mystery novels and local history books. "Pinnacle isn't just one company. It's part of a larger investment group that specializes in what they call neighborhood transformation projects." She spread out printouts showing corporate family trees, with Pinnacle at the center of a network that included marketing firms, property management companies, and even media production studios. The content creators targeting our businesses were connected to at least 3 different companies within this network. "They've done this before," Sarah continued. "I found similar patterns in Brooklyn, Portland, and Austin. Same tactics, same types of viral content, same pressure campaigns against existing business owners." This revelation was both encouraging and terrifying. Encouraging because it meant we weren't dealing with an isolated incident, which strengthened our case for federal investigation. Terrifying because it meant we were up against an organization with experience and resources, far beyond what we'd initially imagined. But knowledge is power, and now we knew exactly what we were fighting. The next phase of our strategy focused on telling our own story. If Pinnacle's marketing team could create viral content, we could create authentic community engagement. The difference was that our version would be true. I started by reaching out to customers I'd known for decades, people who had deep roots in Millbrook, and understood what our businesses meant to the neighborhood. Mrs. Eleanor Walsh, who'd been shopping at my store since I took over from my father, was my first recruit. Eleanor was 78 years old, sharp as a tack, and had raised 6 children in Millbrook before becoming a substitute teacher at the local elementary school. She also happened to be very active on Facebook, with hundreds of friends and family members who followed her posts about community events and neighborhood news. "Those young people think they can just waltz in here and erase our history," she said when I explained the situation. "Well, they're about to learn that this community has more fight in it than they bargained for." Eleanor began posting her own content about our businesses, but from the perspective of someone who'd watched them serve the neighborhood for generations. Her photos of my store included captions that told real stories: how I'd extended credit to families during the 2008 recession, how I'd organized food drives during the pandemic, how I'd stayed open during snowstorms to make sure elderly residents could get their medications and groceries. The response was immediate and powerful. Eleanor's posts were shared hundreds of times, reaching people throughout the city who'd grown up in Millbrook or had family connections to the neighborhood. Comments poured in from former residents who remembered shopping at my store as children, from customers who'd moved away but still considered it part of their community identity. Rosa organized something similar for her restaurant, reaching out to families who'd been celebrating special occasions there for decades. The Morales family, who'd held their daughter's quinceañera at Rosa's 5 years earlier, posted a heartfelt tribute to the restaurant's role in preserving Mexican culture and tradition in a rapidly changing neighborhood. Tom from the hardware store had perhaps the most effective response. He'd been fixing things for Millbrook residents since 1987, and he had stories about every type of repair imaginable. His customers began sharing photos of projects he'd helped them complete, from leaky faucets to rebuilt engines, always with captions about how his expertise and personal service had made their lives better. But the most powerful counter-narrative came from an unexpected source:
the teenagers who worked part-time jobs at our businesses. Carmen from the beauty salon employed 3 high school students who helped with cleaning and basic tasks after school and on weekends.
These young people, all of whom lived in the neighborhood and attended Millbrook High, had watched our businesses become the subject of viral mockery, and they were furious about it. "These content creators don't even live here," said Maya, a 17-year-old who'd been working for Carmen for 2 years. "They just show up, make fun of everything, and leave." "But we actually know these people. They're our neighbors." Maya and her friends created their own social media campaign, using platforms and hashtags that could reach the same audience targeted by Pinnacle's marketing team. But instead of mocking our businesses, they showed them as vibrant parts of a living community. Their videos featured real customers talking about why they chose to shop locally, real employees discussing what these jobs meant to them, and real community members explaining how these businesses had supported them during difficult times. The contrast with the artificial viral content was striking and effective. Within 2 weeks, our grassroots response had generated more authentic engagement than months of Pinnacle's paid promotion campaign. Local news outlets began picking up the story, framing it as a conflict between community preservation and corporate development, rather than simply a debate about modernization. But while we were winning the public relations battle, I knew the real fight would be won or lost in courtrooms and government offices. That's where my third strategy came into play, the one I hadn't yet shared with my fellow business owners. 3 months earlier, long before the viral video campaign began, I'd received a visit from David Kellner, the Pinnacle representative who'd tried to buy my building. At the time, I'd dismissed him politely and assumed that would be the end of it. But after our conversation, I'd done something that would prove crucial. I'd consulted with Margaret about protecting my asset. Margaret had suggested placing my property in an irrevocable trust, a legal structure that would make it much more difficult for anyone to pressure me into selling or to acquire the building through eminent domain proceedings. The trust was designed to preserve the property for community use in perpetuity, with specific provisions about maintaining affordable commercial space for local businesses. I'd signed the papers without thinking much about them, viewing it as a simple precaution against future financial complications. But now, as Pinnacle escalated their pressure campaign, the trust was becoming my most powerful defense. The beauty of the trust structure was that even if they somehow forced me to sell, the property would remain restricted to community-serving commercial use. Pinnacle couldn't simply demolish it and build luxury condominium. They would have to work within the parameters I'd already established, parameters that made their development project significantly less profitable. But they didn't know about the trust yet. Their harassment campaign was based on the assumption that I was a vulnerable elderly woman who could be intimidated into selling. They had no idea that the legal ground had already shifted beneath their feet. I decided it was time to let them know. The opportunity came sooner than I'd expected. On a Thursday morning in early April, David Kellner walked into my store for the second time. He looked exactly as I remembered: expensive suit, perfect hair, and the kind of smile that suggested he was used to getting what he wanted through charm rather than substance. "Miss Carter," he said, approaching my counter with his arms slightly spread in a gesture that was supposed to convey openness and friendliness. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by again. I wanted to see how you were doing." I continued stocking shelves behind the counter, not rushing to acknowledge his presence. "Mr. Kellner, isn't it? From Pinnacle Urban Development." "That's right. I'm impressed you remembered." He laughed as if my memory was surprising rather than simply functional. "I've been hearing some interesting things about your store lately. Seems like you've become quite the local celebrity." I turned to face him fully, noting the phone in his hand and the way he positioned himself for what was clearly going to be a recorded conversation. "Is that Oh yes. There's been a lot of buzz about this place on social media. Very charming, very authentic. The kind of business that really captures the character of Old Millbrook." Old Millbrook. The phrasing was deliberate, designed to position my store as something from the past rather than part of the present. I smiled politely and waited for him to continue. "You know, Mrs. Carter, I've been thinking about our conversation last fall, the offer we discussed for your building. Given all the attention your store has been getting lately, I wonder if you might be interested in revisiting that discussion." The attention from those young people with the cameras? Kellner's smile flickered slightly, Well, yes. Among other things, social media can be a double-edged sword, can't it? Sometimes the attention isn't entirely flattering. There it was, the implicit threat delivered with practiced subtlety. He was letting me know that he was aware of the viral video campaign while maintaining plausible deniability about his company's involvement. I haven't found it particularly troubling, I replied calmly. Young people have always had their own ways of expressing themselves. Of course, but you know how these things can escalate. Once something goes viral, it tends to take on a life of its own. People start forming opinions, making judgments. It could potentially impact your business. I nodded thoughtfully, as if seriously considering his concern. You're probably right. In fact, I've been taking some steps to protect my business interests. Oh? Kellner leaned forward slightly, probably expecting me to express vulnerability or ask for his help. Yes, I've been working with my attorney to make sure all my assets are properly protected. You'd be amazed how complicated property law can be when you start looking into trusts and preservation easements. The change in Kellner's expression was subtle but unmistakable. The practiced charm remained, but something sharper flickered behind his eye. Trusts can be useful, he said carefully, though they can also create complications if you ever want to, say, sell property or make changes to how it's used. Oh, I don't think I'll need to worry about that. My attorney set everything up to ensure the property remains in community hands permanently. Very forward-thinking of her, really. She said it would protect against any kind of pressure or coercion. Kellner was quiet for a moment, and I could practically see him calculating how this new information affected his company's plans. Well, he said finally, that sounds very. I hope you won't mind if I have my legal team take a look at the public records, just to understand how that might impact any future development in the area. Of course not. Margaret always files everything properly with the city, very transparent process. After Kellner left, I called Jim immediately. He took the bait, I told him. Pinnacle knows about the trust now, and they're going to research exactly what it means for their project. Good, Jim replied. That should trigger some interesting conversations within their organization. When people start realizing their plans are more complicated than they thought, they tend to make mistakes. What kind of mistakes? The kind that provide evidence for federal investigation. If they've been operating under the assumption that they could acquire your property through intimidation, learning about the trust might prompt them to try more aggressive tactics, and aggressive tactics leave paper trails. Jim was right. Over the next week, 3 different law firms requested copies of my trust documents from the city planning office. Pinnacle was clearly trying to find loopholes or weaknesses they could exploit, but Margaret had done her work well. The trust was ironclad, designed specifically to prevent exactly the kind of manipulation Pinnacle had been attempting. Any attempt to challenge it would require proving that I'd been coerced or deceived when I signed the papers, which would be difficult since I'd initiated the process months before their harassment campaign began. More importantly, the trust included provisions that Margaret had added at Jim's suggestion, clauses that would trigger federal oversight if anyone attempted to interfere with the property through fraudulent means. Pinnacle wasn't just dealing with a stubborn old woman anymore. They were dealing with a legal structure designed to resist exactly their kind of pressure. The next phase of their campaign revealed just how desperate they were becoming. It started with code enforcement. Within days of Kellner's visit to my store, I received a notice from the city claiming that my building violated current safety regulations. The inspector, a young man I'd never seen before, arrived with a clipboard and a very thorough checklist. He found violations everywhere. My fire extinguisher was the wrong type, my emergency exit signage was outdated, my electrical system needed updating, and my inventory storage violated modern space requirements. Each violation came with a fine and a deadline for correction. The total cost of compliance would be over $30,000. I called Margaret immediately. This is harassment, I told her. I've passed every inspection for 37 years. Now suddenly everything is wrong. Margaret reviewed the violations and quickly identified the problem. These aren't legitimate safety issues, she explained. They're applying commercial building codes that were updated last year, codes that don't actually apply to buildings of your size and age. Someone specifically requested this inspection and provided guidance about what to look for. Can we fight it? Absolutely. But that's not the interesting part. The interesting part is that requesting this kind of targeted inspection requires specific knowledge of city regulations and established relationships with the enforcement office. This isn't something random activists could arrange. Margaret was right. The code enforcement harassment was sophisticated, coordinated, and expensive. It had Pinnacle's fingerprints all over it, but they weren't finished. The next week brought a visit from the health department, with concerns about food safety in my small grocery operation. Then came the fire department, with questions about occupancy limits and emergency procedures. Each inspection found violations that would require expensive correction. The pattern was clear: death by 1,000 cuts. If they couldn't buy my building or intimidate me into selling, they would try to make operating it so expensive and complicated that I'd have no choice but to give up. What they didn't realize was that each violation notice was evidence of their harassment campaign. Margaret was photographing and filing everything, building a paper trail that connected directly to Pinnacle's timeline and tactic. But the most damaging evidence came from an unexpected source: the content creators themselves. Maya, the teenager who worked at Carmen's beauty salon, had been monitoring the social media accounts that had originally targeted our businesses. She'd noticed that several of the creators had become sloppy about maintaining their personas, occasionally posting content that revealed more than they intended. "Ms. Carter," she said when she stopped by my store after school one Friday, "you need to see this." She showed me a video posted by the bearded creator who'd been one of my most persistent harassers. It was a behind-the-scenes look at his content creation process, filmed in what appeared to be a professional office space. In the background, clearly visible on a whiteboard, was a timeline for something called Phase 3 regulatory pressure. The timeline included specific dates for code enforcement, health department inspections, and fire department visits. It was dated 2 weeks before any of those inspections had actually occurred. "He basically confessed to the whole conspiracy," Maya said with satisfaction, "and he posted it publicly." I immediately forwarded the video to Jim, Danny, and Mark. Within hours, Jim called back with news that would change everything. "Beulah, this is the evidence we've been waiting for. My contacts at the federal level are ready to move forward with a formal investigation. Conspiracy to commit wire fraud, extortion, violation of federal racketeering statute. This video gives us everything we need to prove coordination and intent. What happens now? Now we let them keep digging their own grave while we build an airtight case, but I need you to be very careful. When federal investigators start making inquiries, these people are going to realize they're in serious trouble. Desperate people make poor decisions." Jim was right to be concerned. The next week brought the most aggressive escalation yet: a surprise visit from immigration enforcement, based on an anonymous tip, claiming I was employing undocumented workers. The irony was that I had no employee. I'd been running the store by myself for decades, occasionally hiring neighborhood teenagers for part-time help, but always ensuring all paperwork was properly complete. But the immigration officers didn't know that when they arrived, and their presence outside my store with official vehicles and uniforms sent exactly the message Pinnacle intended. This business was under federal investigation. The visual impact was devastating. Customers who saw the immigration vehicles assumed the worst and avoided the store for days. Several longtime patrons called to ask if I was in legal trouble, expressing concern, but also uncertainty about whether they should continue shopping there. But this escalation also provided the final piece of evidence Jim needed. Immigration enforcement doesn't respond to anonymous tips. By conducting surprise raids, those operations require specific intelligence and official requests through proper channels. Someone with significant influence had arranged this harassment, and that someone had access to federal resources. Within 48 hours, Jim's contacts had traced the immigration complaint back through official channel. The request had originated from a concerned citizen, who turned out to be a private investigator employed by one of Pinnacle's subsidiary companies. They just committed a federal crime,
Jim explained when he called with the news. Using immigration enforcement as a tool for commercial harassment is a serious violation. We're not just talking about civil penalties anymore, there could be criminal charges. That same day, Danny called with equally encouraging news from his digital investigation. Aunt Beulah, I finally cracked their payment system. I've got bank records showing direct payments from Pinnacle Urban Development to 3 different marketing companies, and from those companies to the individual content creators. The financial trail was clear and comprehensive. Pinnacle had paid for every aspect of the harassment campaign, from the viral videos to the coordinated social media promotion to the regulatory pressure. They'd created a paper trail that documented their conspiracy in detail. But the most satisfying discovery came from Sarah's continued research into Pinnacle's broader operations. She'd found evidence that the company was facing serious financial difficulties, with several major projects behind schedule and over budget. They're not just trying to acquire your property because they want it, she explained during our weekly meeting at Rosa's Cafe. They need it to keep their investors from pulling out. If they can't deliver this project on schedule, the entire company could collapse. That realization shifted everything. We weren't dealing with a powerful corporation that could afford to wait us out. We were dealing with a desperate organization that had bet everything on a timeline they could no longer meet. The pressure they'd been applying to us was nothing compared to the pressure they were facing from their investors and creditors. Every day they couldn't move forward with demolition, and construction was costing them money they apparently didn't have, which meant it was time to stop playing defense and start applying some pressure of our own. I called an emergency meeting of all the business owners, this time including several newcomers who'd heard about our situation and wanted to help. Dr. Tricia Williams, who ran a small medical clinic 2 blocks away, had experience dealing with corporate harassment from insurance companies. Marcus Johnson, who owned a small construction company, understood the building industry and had contacts throughout the city government. It's time to go public, I told the group. Not just with social media posts and community organizing, but with everything we've learned about Pinnacle's operations. Dr. Williams nodded vigorously. I've dealt with companies like this before. They depend on operating in shadows, using intimidation and financial pressure, while maintaining plausible deniability. Once their tactics are exposed publicly, they lose most of their power. Marcus had a different suggestion. What if we approached this from the business angle? If Pinnacle is really in financial trouble, their investors need to know what kind of illegal tactics the company has been using. Investors hate legal liability. Sarah, ever the researcher, had already started working on that angle. I've identified 3 of Pinnacle's major investors, including a pension fund that specifically prohibits investment in companies facing federal criminal investigation. If we can document the illegal harassment campaign, the investors will pull their funding, and Pinnacle's financial problems become insurmountable. We spent the rest of the evening planning a comprehensive disclosure strategy. Local media outlets would receive detailed information about the harassment campaign, including all the evidence we'd collected. Pinnacle's investors would receive formal notification about the federal investigation and the company's illegal tactics. City officials would be provided with documentation showing how Pinnacle had abused the regulatory enforcement process. But the most important component was a formal complaint to the Securities and Exchange Commission, alleging that Pinnacle had engaged in fraudulent practices that materially affected their financial representations to investors. Securities fraud is taken very seriously by federal regulators, Williams explained. If Pinnacle has been lying to investors about their timeline and acquisition costs, while using illegal tactics to acquire property, that's exactly the kind of case the SEC loves to prosecute. As I walked home that night, I reflected on how dramatically things had changed over the past 2 months.
What had started as simple harassment from social media content creators had evolved into a comprehensive federal investigation involving multiple agencies and potentially criminal charges. But more than that, I'd discovered something about myself that I'd forgotten during years of quiet routine. I wasn't just a shop owner trying to preserve her business. I was a woman with resources, connections, and the determination to fight back against people who thought they could intimidate me. Pinnacle Urban Development had chosen the wrong target. They'd assumed that age meant weakness, that politeness meant passivity, that a small business owner couldn't possibly stand up to a well-funded corporation. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The next morning, I opened my store as usual, but with a sense of anticipation I hadn't felt in years. Today was the day we would stop reacting to their attacks and start launching our own. By noon, our carefully coordinated disclosure would be in the hands of journalists, investigators, and regulators throughout the city and state. Pinnacle's harassment campaign was about to become front-page news, and their financial problems were about to become public knowledge. I arranged fresh flowers in my window display, humming softly to myself as I worked. The lavender in my back garden was beginning to bloom, filling the air with the scent of spring and renewal. It was going to be a beautiful day. The morning news cycle moved faster than I'd anticipated. By 8 a.m., 3 local television stations had picked up the story about Pinnacle Urban Development's harassment campaign. By 10 a.m., the business section of the regional newspaper featured a front-page article titled "Development Company Under Federal Investigation for Alleged Intimidation Tactics." I watched the coverage from behind my store counter, serving my regular customers while keeping one eye on the small television I'd installed years ago to provide background noise during slow periods. The irony wasn't lost on me that the same device these content creators had mocked as outdated was now showing their downfall in real time. The reporter, a sharp-eyed woman named Jennifer Martinez, who specialized in corporate accountability stories, had done her homework. She'd not only covered the harassment campaign against our businesses, but had also dug into Pinnacle's financial records and investor relationships. The picture she painted was damning: a development company using increasingly desperate tactics to salvage a failing project. Sources close to the investigation confirm that federal authorities are examining whether Pinnacle Urban Development orchestrated a systematic campaign of harassment against local business owners who refused to sell their properties. Martinez reported from in front of my store. The campaign allegedly included coordinated social media attacks, regulatory harassment, and abuse of federal enforcement resources. What made the coverage particularly effective was Martinez's decision to focus on the human impact rather than just the legal technicality. She'd interviewed several of my longtime customers, including Mrs. Eleanor Walsh, who spoke eloquently about what our businesses meant to the community. "These aren't just stores and restaurants," Eleanor said, standing in front of Rose's Cafe with the morning rush visible through the windows behind her. "These are the places where we've celebrated births and mourned losses, where we've weathered economic storms and celebrated good times. You can't just replace that with luxury condominiums." But the most powerful segment featured Maya and her friends from the high school, the teenagers who'd created the counter-narrative to Pinnacle's viral video campaign. Watching these young people speak with passion and sophistication about community preservation and corporate accountability gave me hope for the future in a way I hadn't expected. "They think because we're young, we don't understand what's happening," Maya told the camera. "But we grew up here. We know these business owners. We've seen how they take care of people." What Pinnacle was doing wasn't just illegal, it was cruel. The television coverage triggered a cascade of additional attention. By afternoon, reporters from 2 statewide newspapers had arrived in Millbrook, conducting interviews and photographing our businesses. A blogger who specialized in gentrification issues drove down from the state capitol to document our story. Even a freelance photographer working on a book about small-town America asked permission to spend the day capturing images of our neighborhood. But the attention that mattered most came from federal investigators. Jim called around noon with an update that made my hands shake with a combination of relief and vindication. "The FBI has opened a formal investigation," he told me. "Multiple federal agencies are now involved: Bureau of Investigation for the racketeering charges, SEC for securities fraud, Immigration and Customs Enforcement for the abuse of federal resources, and the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division for targeting based on age discrimination." I had to sit down. All of that from some viral videos. All of that from a pattern of criminal behavior that escalated far beyond what they probably intended. These people started with social media harassment and ended up committing federal crime. The investigators are calling it one of the most thoroughly documented corporate conspiracy cases they've seen. Jim explained that our months of careful evidence collection had provided investigators with what they called a prosecutorial gift: clear timelines, documented financial relationships, recorded conversations, and physical evidence of coordination. The case was so strong that federal prosecutors were already discussing plea bargain possibilities. What does that mean for me? For my store, it means you won. Beulah Pinnacle can't move forward with their development project while they're under federal investigation. Their investors are already pulling funding, and their insurance companies are refusing to cover legal liabilities. Even if they somehow survived the criminal charges, they don't have the resources to continue the harassment campaign. The relief was overwhelming, but it was mixed with something else: a sense of empowerment I hadn't felt in decades. I wasn't just a victim who'd been rescued by federal investigators. I was a woman who'd identified a threat, built a coalition, gathered evidence, and fought back effectively. The afternoon brought unexpected visitors: David Kellner and two other men in expensive suits, who I assumed were Pinnacle executives. They looked haggard, like people who hadn't slept well in several days, and their earlier confidence had been replaced by something that looked suspiciously like panic. "Mrs. Carter," Kellner said, approaching my counter with none of his previous swagger, "I wonder if we could have a conversation." I finished helping a customer who was purchasing ingredients for a dinner party, taking my time to make sure I'd given her correct change, and that she had everything she needed. Only then did I turn my attention to the Pinnacle representatives. "Of course," I said pleasantly. "What can I do for you gentlemen?" Kellner glanced at his companions before speaking. "We wanted to discuss the recent misunderstandings about our development project. We think there may have been some miscommunication about our intentions and methods." Misunderstandings, miscommunication, the language of corporate damage control, carefully chosen to avoid admitting actual wrongdoing while creating space for negotiation. "I'm not sure what you mean," I replied. "Everything seems quite clear from my perspective." One of the other men, a silver-haired executive who introduced himself as Robert Marsh, Pinnacle's chief operating officer, stepped forward. "Mrs. Carter, we recognize that some of our marketing partners may have used inappropriate tactics in promoting our development vision. We want to make things right." Marketing partners, another carefully chosen phrase designed to create distance between Pinnacle and the harassment campaign they'd orchestrated. "What kind of inappropriate tact?" I asked, genuinely curious to see how they would characterize months of systematic harassment. Marsh looked uncomfortable. "Social media content that may have been insensitive, regulatory inquiries that may have been overzealous. We never intended for things to escalate the way they did." I nodded thoughtfully, as if considering their explanation. "And what would making things right look like?" The third man, who'd been silent until now, pulled out a leather portfolio and placed it on my counter. "We'd like to offer you a substantial settlement that would compensate you for any inconvenience you've experienced, while also providing a generous purchase price for your property that would allow you to retire comfortably anywhere you choose." I opened the portfolio and examined the documents inside. The settlement offer was indeed substantial, enough money to buy a house in any neighborhood I wanted, with enough left over to live comfortably for the rest of my life. The property purchase price was nearly 4 times what they'd originally offered, but attached to the settlement was a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement that would prevent me from discussing their tactics with investigators, journalists, or anyone else. Accepting their offer would effectively end the federal investigation and allow them to proceed with their development project. "This is quite generous," I said, closing the portfolio and sliding it back across the counter. "But I'm afraid I'm not interested." All three men looked genuinely shocked, as if they couldn't comprehend why anyone would turn down that much money. "Mrs. Carter," Kellner said, "I don't think you understand the full scope of what we're offering. This amount would allow you to live anywhere in the country, in any style you want. You could travel, buy a luxury home, never worry about money again." "I understand perfectly," I replied, "and I'm still not interested." Marsh leaned forward, his voice taking on a more urgent tone.
Miss Carter, I need you to understand that our company is facing serious financial difficulties as a result of these investigations. If we can't resolve this situation quickly, a lot of people are going to lose their jobs. Investors will lose money. The entire project will collapse. I felt a momentary pang of sympathy for the employees who might lose their jobs through no fault of their own, but it was quickly replaced by anger at Marsh's attempt to make me feel responsible for consequences that his company had brought on themselves. Miss Marsh, I said, my voice remaining calm but taking on a steel edge that surprised even me, your company chose to try intimidating an elderly woman instead of conducting legitimate business negotiation. You chose to harass an entire community of small business owners instead of respecting our rights. You chose to abuse federal enforcement resources instead of following the law. The consequences of those choices are not my responsibility. The three men exchanged glances, and I could see them recalculating their approach. What would it take? The unnamed third man asked. What would you need to reconsider? I pretended to think about it for a moment, though I'd already decided my answer weeks ago. Nothing you can offer. My property isn't for sale, my community isn't for sale, and my integrity certainly isn't for sale. After they left, I called Jim to report the settlement offer. He wasn't surprised. That's exactly what we expected. Companies facing federal investigation always try to buy their way out of trouble before the real consequences hit. The size of their offer tells us how desperate they are. They mentioned that employees would lose jobs if the company collapsed. That's probably true, but those employees were working for a company that committed federal crimes. The blame for their situation rests with Pinnacle's executives, not with you. Jim was right. But I still felt a twinge of sympathy for people who'd been caught up in their employers' illegal schemes. However, that sympathy wasn't enough to make me abandon the fight for my community and my principles. The next week brought developments that confirmed just how right we'd been to refuse Pinnacle's settlement offer. The federal investigation had expanded beyond our local situation to include similar harassment campaigns Pinnacle had conducted in other cities. Sarah's research into the company's broader operations had attracted the attention of federal investigators, who discovered that Millbrook was just one of 6 communities where Pinnacle had used similar tactics. Journalists in Portland, Austin, and Brooklyn had found evidence of coordinated social media harassment, regulatory abuse, and intimidation campaigns targeting small business owners who refused to sell to the company. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Federal prosecutors were now looking at a pattern of criminal behavior that spanned multiple states and potentially dozens of victims. What had started as an investigation into harassment against our small group of business owners had become a major federal case involving organized crime statutes and interstate commerce violations. But the most satisfying development came from an unexpected source. Pinnacle's own investor, Marcus Johnson, the construction company owner who'd joined our coalition, had connections throughout the real estate and development industry. Through his network, he'd learned that 3 of Pinnacle's major investors had initiated their own investigation into the company's practices after our story became public. Corporate investors hate surprises, Marcus explained during one of our evening meetings at Rosa's Cafe. When they invest in a development company, they expect professional management and legal compliance. Finding out that their money was used to fund harassment campaigns and criminal activity is exactly the kind of surprise that makes them pull their funding immediately. The investor revolt had apparently been swift and comprehensive. Within days of our story breaking, Pinnacle had lost access to more than 60% of their development funding. Without that capital, they couldn't continue existing projects, much less start new ones. But the final blow came from a source I'd never considered: their insurance companies. Dr. Patricia Williams, who dealt with corporate liability issues in her medical practice, explained how insurance coverage worked for development companies. They carry multiple types of coverage: general liability, professional liability, directors and officers insurance. But all of those policies have exclusions for criminal activity and intentional misconduct. Once news of the federal investigation became public, Pinnacle's insurance companies had begun their own reviews of the company's practices, finding evidence of deliberate harassment campaigns and criminal conspiracy. They'd suspended coverage for all of Pinnacle's operations. A development company can't operate without insurance coverage, Dr. Williams continued. No bank will lend money, no contractor will work with them, no city will issue permits. Losing insurance coverage is essentially a corporate death sentence. The combination of federal investigation, investor flight, and insurance suspension had apparently been too much for Pinnacle's corporate structure to survive. Marcus received word through his industry contacts that the company was preparing to file for bankruptcy protection within the month. But even as Pinnacle collapsed, the federal investigation continued. Prosecutors were pursuing charges against individual executives who'd orchestrated the harassment campaigns, regardless of whether the company survived. According to Jim, the case had become a high-priority example of how federal authorities would respond to corporate intimidation tactics. They want to send a message, he explained. Companies need to know that they can't use harassment and intimidation as business tools, even if their targets are small business owners who seem powerless to fight back. The criminal charges, when they were finally announced, exceeded even our most optimistic expectations. David Kellner was indicted on 14 federal counts, including wire fraud, conspiracy, extortion, and civil rights violations. Robert Marsh and 2 other executives faced similar charges. Even some of the content creators who'd participated in the harassment campaign were charged with conspiracy and wire fraud, but the charges that gave me the most satisfaction were those filed against the executives who'd arranged the immigration enforcement harassment. Using federal immigration resources to intimidate a business owner was apparently a particularly serious crime, carrying potential prison sentences of up to 10 years. As I read through the indictments that Jim had provided, I felt a sense of justice that went beyond personal vindication. These charges would serve as a warning to other companies that might consider using similar tactics against small business owners and community members who couldn't afford expensive legal representation. The media coverage of the indictments brought a new wave of attention to our story, but this time, the focus was different. Instead of just covering the harassment campaign and its resolution, journalists were now examining the broader implications of corporate intimidation tactics and community resistance. A national business magazine published a feature article about our coalition, describing it as a model for how small business owners could organize to defend themselves against corporate harassment. A legal journal analyzed the case as an example of effective evidence collection by non-lawyer. Even a sociology professor from the state university visited to interview us about community organizing strategies, but the attention that meant the most to me came from other small business owners who'd faced similar pressures in their own community. Letters and emails poured in from around the country, describing harassment campaigns, intimidation tactics, and pressure to sell to developers who refused to take no for an answer. Many of these business owners had felt isolated and helpless, convinced that they were dealing with situations too small to interest federal investigators, or too complicated for local authorities to understand. Our success in building a federal case gave them hope that they could fight back effectively against corporate intimidation. I found myself serving as an informal consultant to other communities facing similar pressures, sharing strategies for evidence collection, coalition building, and working with federal investigators. It was rewarding work that gave new purpose to the knowledge and experience I'd gained through our fight against Pinnacle, but the most meaningful recognition came from my own community. The City Council passed a resolution commending our coalition for defending community values against corporate intimidation. The Chamber of Commerce created a new award for business leadership in community preservation, and named me as the first recipient. Even more touching was the informal recognition from my neighbors and customers. People who'd known me for decades began treating me differently, not with the polite deference often shown to elderly women, but with the respect accorded to someone who'd proven themselves capable of taking on powerful opponents and winning. Maya and her friends from the high school organized a celebration in the small park across from my store, inviting all the business owners who'd participated in our coalition and the community members who'd supported us. It was a modest event, just folding tables with homemade food and a small sound system playing music, but it felt like the most important celebration I'd ever attended. Standing in that park, surrounded by people who'd stood with me through months of harassment and uncertainty, I realized that we'd accomplished something more significant than just defeating a corporate harassment campaign. We'd proven that communities could still organize effectively against powerful interests, that age and politeness didn't have to mean powerlessness, and that ordinary people could hold corporations accountable for illegal behavior. Rosa gave a short speech, thanking everyone who'd participated in our coalition, but she saved her final words for me. Beulah showed us that you don't have to be loud to be strong, you don't have to be young to be effective, and you don't have to be powerful to stand up for what's right. The applause that followed felt like vindication, not just for our specific fight, but for every time I'd been underestimated because of my age, every time someone had assumed that politeness meant weakness, every time I'd been dismissed as irrelevant to modern concern. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came 3 months later, when David Kellner was sentenced to 2 years in federal prison for his role in the harassment campaign. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s who reminded me of several teachers I'd admired in my youth, delivered remarks that captured exactly why our case had been so important. The defendants in this case thought they could intimidate citizens who didn't have the resources to fight back. Judge Patricia Morrison said from the bench, they thought that age and modest means would make their victims powerless. They were wrong. This sentence reflects not just the seriousness of their crimes, but the importance of protecting all citizens from corporate intimidation, regardless of their age, resources, or perceived vulnerability. Sitting in the federal courthouse that day, watching Kellner receive his sentence, I thought about all the changes that had occurred since that first group of content creators had walked into my store with their phones and their arrogant assumptions about what they could get away with. My store was busier than ever, attracting customers who'd heard our story and wanted to support a business that had stood up to corporate pressure. Several of the other coalition businesses were experiencing similar increases in community support. More importantly, our neighborhood had developed a new sense of solidarity and effectiveness. The coalition we'd formed to fight Pinnacle had evolved into an ongoing community organization that monitored development proposals, advocated for small business interests, and provided support for residents facing various types of pressure or harassment. We'd also inspired similar groups in other communities, creating a network of small business owners and community activists who shared information about corporate intimidation tactics and strategies for fighting back. The knowledge we'd gained through our experience was helping other people defend their communities against similar threats. But the change that mattered most to me was personal. I was no longer just Beulah Carter, the quiet elderly woman who ran a small grocery store. I was Beulah Carter, the community leader who'd taken on a powerful corporation and won. I was someone who'd proven that underestimation could be a powerful weapon when wielded by someone who understood how to use it effectively. The content creators who'd originally targeted me had based their entire campaign on assumptions about what an elderly woman could or couldn't do, what she would or wouldn't know, how she would or wouldn't respond to pressure. Those assumptions had been their downfall, because they'd prevented them from seeing the real threat I represented. They'd seen an easy target and missed the fact that I owned the building they needed, had the patience to outlast their pressure campaigns, possessed the intelligence to understand their tactics, and maintained the relationships necessary to organize effective resistance. Most importantly, they'd failed to understand that a lifetime of being underestimated had taught me exactly how to use other people's low expectations against them. Standing behind my store counter now, arranging fresh flowers and greeting customers who'd become not just purchasers but community allies, I smiled at the irony of it all. These young content creators had set out to make me look outdated and irrelevant, to paint me as someone who didn't belong in the modern world. Instead, they'd helped me discover that everything they'd mocked about me, my age, my experience, my knowledge of the community, my patience, my attention to detail, had been exactly the qualities I needed to defeat them.
They'd wanted to make me feel small and powerless. Instead, they'd reminded me just how formidable a determined woman could be when she finally decided to stop apologizing for taking up space in the world. The lavender in my back garden was blooming magnificently that summer, filling the air with fragrance and attracting more bees and butterflies than I'd seen in years. It was a perfect metaphor for what had happened to my life. What had looked like it might be destroyed had instead flourished in ways I'd never expected. And every morning when I watered those plants, I thought about David Kellner sitting in his federal prison cell, probably wondering how an elderly grocery store owner had managed to completely destroy his life and career. I hoped he was learning the same lesson I'd learned. Never underestimate a woman who's lived long enough to understand exactly how powerful she really is. 2 years had passed since David Kellner's sentencing, and the morning light streaming through my store windows carried the promise of another busy day. I was arranging a display of local honey when the bell above my door chimed, announcing the arrival of someone I hadn't expected to see again. It was the girl with the nose ring, the one who'd called herself a Millbrook babe during those months of harassment. But she looked different now, smaller somehow, with an uncertainty in her posture that hadn't been there before. Her carefully curated aesthetic had been replaced by simple jeans and a plain sweater, and her once confident demeanor seemed fragile, hesitant. "Mrs. Carter," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm Chloe Morrison. I don't know if you remember me, but I made some videos about your store." I set down the jar of honey I'd been holding and studied her face. She was younger than I'd realized during those confrontational months. Probably no more than 22 or 23. Without the makeup and careful lighting of her social media content, she looked like what she was, a very young woman who'd made some very serious mistakes. "I remember you," I said calmly. "What can I do?" Chloe shifted her weight from foot to foot, clearly struggling with whatever she'd come to say. "I wanted to apologize. I know that probably doesn't mean much now, after everything that happened, but I needed to say it anyway." I waited for her to continue, not making it easier for her, but not making it harder either. "I lost my job," she said quietly. "Actually, I lost 3 jobs. Once the federal case became public, no marketing company would hire me. They said I was a liability because of the criminal charges." She paused, swallowing hard. "I pled guilty to conspiracy charges. I'm on probation for 2 years, and I have to do community service." I nodded, remembering that several of the content creators had accepted plea bargains rather than face trial. The sentences had been lighter than what Kellner and the Pinnacle executives received, but they'd still faced real consequences for their actions. "I moved back in with my parents," Chloe continued. "I had to sell my car to pay for the lawyer, and I'm working at a coffee shop now, trying to save money to pay back the settlement fees." She was referring to the civil lawsuit that our coalition had filed against Pinnacle and the individual participants in the harassment campaign. Even though the company had filed for bankruptcy, we'd been able to recover damages from some of the individuals involved, including the content creators who'd been paid to target our businesses. "But that's not why I'm here," Chloe said, taking a deep breath. "I'm here because I wanted you to know that I understand now what we did to you. What I did to you." I leaned against my counter, genuinely curious to hear what she had to say. "When I was making those videos, I thought it was just content, just funny observations about old-fashioned stuff. I didn't think about you as a real person with real feelings and a real life that we were making fun of." Her voice cracked slightly. "I thought you were just, I don't know, a character, or something. Someone who existed to be laughed." It was perhaps the most honest thing anyone had said to me about the entire experience. The dehumanization had been the cruelest part of the harassment, the way they'd treated me as a prop in their content, rather than as a person deserving of basic respect. "What changed your mind?" I asked. Chloe looked down at her hands. "My grandmother. She's 78. And she runs a small alteration shop in our town. After everything came out about what I'd done, some local kids started making TikToks about her shop, calling it vintage sewing vibes, and making fun of the way she uses old equipment." She met my eyes, and I could see genuine pain there. Watching someone mock my grandmother the same way I'd mocked you, it made me realize what I'd actually done, how cruel it was, how wrong it was. I felt a flicker of sympathy for this young woman who'd clearly learned a hard lesson about consequences, and empathy. But I also remembered the months of humiliation and stress her actions had caused, the way her videos had made me question my own worth and place in the community. I appreciate your apology, I said, but I have to ask, are you here because you genuinely feel remorse, or because your lawyer suggested this might help with your legal situation? Chloe flinched as if I'd slapped her, but she answered honestly. My lawyer did say that showing genuine remorse could help with the civil settlement negotiations, but that's not why I'm here. I'm here because I've been thinking about you for 2 years, wondering if you were okay, feeling sick about what we put you through. She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I wrote you a letter. Not for court or anything legal, just personal. You don't have to read it if you don't want to, but I wanted to give it to you anyway. I took the letter but didn't open it immediately. What are you planning to do now? After your probation is finished, I don't know, she admitted. I can't work in marketing anymore. Obviously, I'm thinking about going back to school, maybe studying social work or education, something where I can actually help people instead of hurting them. We talked for a few more minutes about her community service work at a senior center, where she was helping elderly residents learn to use smartphones and tablets. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. The young woman who'd once mocked an elderly business owner for being behind the times was now teaching technology to seniors. After she left, I opened her letter. It was 3 pages long, handwritten in careful script, and it detailed her journey from entitled content creator to someone who understood the real impact of her action. She wrote about watching her grandmother cry after seeing the TikToks that mocked her shop, about the shame she felt when her parents learned what she'd done, about the isolation of being unemployable in her chosen field. But the part that affected me most was her description of visiting my store's social media presence after the federal case concluded. She'd seen the post from longtime customers describing what my business meant to them, the photos of community events I'd hosted, the testimonials from families I'd helped during difficult times. I realized that I'd tried to destroy something beautiful and important without ever understanding what it was. She wrote, "You weren't just an old lady with outdated ideas, you were the heart of a community, someone who'd spent decades taking care of people and making their lives better. What I did was evil, and I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed you to know that I understand that now." I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer where I kept important documents. I wasn't ready to forgive Chloe, but I was glad she'd found a way to understand the harm she'd caused. Perhaps that understanding would help her make better choices in the future. The encounter with Chloe reminded me of how dramatically life had changed since those dark months of harassment. My store was thriving in ways I'd never imagined possible. The publicity from our successful fight against Pinnacle had attracted customers from throughout the region, people who wanted to support a business that had stood up to corporate intimidation. More importantly, our coalition had evolved into something much larger and more influential than any of us had originally envisioned. What had started as a desperate alliance of small business owners had become a model for community organizing that was being studied and replicated across the country. The Millbrook Community Defense Coalition, as we'd eventually named ourselves, now provided resources and support to communities facing similar corporate pressure campaigns. We'd helped business owners in 12 different states organize resistance to development company harassment, and our documentation and evidence-gathering methods had become standard practice for groups fighting corporate intimidation. Sarah had written a book about our experience titled "Fighting Back: How Small Communities Can Resist Corporate Bullying." The book had become required reading in several university courses about community organizing and business ethics, and Sarah was frequently invited to speak at conferences about grassroots resistance strategy. Rosa had expanded her restaurant, using the increased business from our publicity to add a private dining room where we held our monthly coalition meeting. The space had become an informal community center, hosting everything from neighborhood association meetings to retirement parties for longtime residents. Patricia Williams had opened a second medical clinic specifically focused on serving elderly patients who felt intimidated by larger medical facilities. Her practice had become a model for age-friendly healthcare, and she'd testified before the state legislature about the importance of protecting elderly citizens from various forms of exploitation. But perhaps the most satisfying development was Maya's trajectory. The teenager who'd helped organize our social media counter-campaign
had earned a full scholarship to the state university, where she was studying journalism and public policy. She'd interned with the newspaper reporter who'd first covered our story, and she was already writing articles about community organizing and corporate accountability. Maya still stopped by my store regularly, bringing me updates about her studies and asking for advice about her career plan. Watching her develop into a confident young advocate reminded me that our fight had implications far beyond our immediate victory over Pinnacle. "You taught me that you don't have to be loud to be powerful," she told me during one of her visits, "and that sometimes the best way to fight back is to be underestimated until you're ready to show them what you're really capable of." The federal investigation that had started with our case had also had far-reaching consequences. The Department of Justice had created a new unit specifically focused on corporate harassment and intimidation tactics, using our case as a template for investigating similar situations. Several other development companies had been prosecuted for using harassment campaigns against property owners, and the legal precedent established by our case had made such tactics much riskier for corporations to attempt. But the most lasting impact might have been cultural. Our story had been covered by national media outlets, featured in documentary films, and discussed in business schools as an example of how corporate arrogance could lead to spectacular legal and financial disaster. The phrase "pulling a pinnacle" had entered business terminology as a description of any corporate strategy that was both unethical and self-destructive. MBA students studied our case as an example of how companies could destroy themselves by underestimating their opponents and overestimating their own power. David Kellner had been released from federal prison after serving 18 months of his 2-year sentence, but his career in real estate development was effectively over. The last I'd heard, he was working as a sales associate at a car dealership in another state, trying to rebuild his life away from the industry where his name had become synonymous with corporate criminality. Robert Marsh and the other Pinnacle executives had faced longer sentences and larger financial penalties. The company itself had been liquidated in bankruptcy proceedings, with its assets sold to pay creditors and victims of their harassment campaign. The properties they'd already acquired in other cities had been sold to community development organizations that committed to preserving affordable housing and local business. As for me, the woman who'd started this entire chain of events by refusing to be intimidated by some young content creators with smartphones, life had settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and entirely new. I still opened my store at 7 every morning, still arranged fresh flowers in the window display, still greeted my regular customers by name and remembered their preference, but I also fielded phone calls from reporters writing follow-up stories, responded to emails from community organizers seeking advice, and hosted visitors from other cities who wanted to learn about our coalition's strategy. The building that Pinnacle had been so desperate to acquire was now worth considerably more than their original inflated offer, thanks to the publicity our story had generated and the demonstrated community support for preserving local business. But I had no intention of selling, regardless of price. Margaret had helped me establish a community trust that would eventually inherit the building, ensuring that it would remain dedicated to serving local residents rather than being converted to luxury condominiums. The trust included provisions for maintaining affordable commercial space for small businesses and community organizations, creating a permanent barrier against future gentrification pressure. My apartment above the store had been renovated and modernized, but I'd kept the elements that connected me to the building's history and my father's legacy. The kitchen where I'd sat making plans to fight Pinnacle now served as an informal office, where I worked on community organizing projects and corresponded with other activists around the country. The back garden where Pinnacle had wanted to build rental units had been expanded and transformed into a community garden that served the entire neighborhood. Families with young children tended vegetable plots while elderly residents like Miss Eleanor Walsh maintained flower beds that provided color and beauty for everyone to enjoy. On quiet evenings, I often sat in that garden with a cup of tea, reflecting on the unexpected turns my life had taken since that first group of content creators had walked into my store with their cameras and their assumptions about what they could get away with. They'd seen an elderly woman who seemed like an easy target for their content creation and their employer's business goals. They'd assumed that age meant weakness, that politeness meant passivity, that a small business owner couldn't possibly fight back against a well-funded corporation. But they'd underestimated the power of experience, the strength that comes from decades of solving problems and building relationships, and the fierce determination that can emerge when someone finally decides they've had enough of being pushed around. Most importantly, they'd failed to understand that being underestimated could be the greatest advantage of all, if you knew how to use it properly. The young woman who'd apologized to me that morning represented something I'd seen repeatedly over the past 2 years: people who'd participated in or supported harassment campaigns against elderly citizens, only to realize later the cruelty and short-sightedness of their actions. Several other content creators who'd targeted our businesses had reached out with similar apologies, and I'd received letters from people around the country who admitted they'd participated in age-based mockery on social media before understanding the real harm such behavior could cause. But apologies, while meaningful, couldn't undo the damage that had been done or restore the confidence that had been shaken. What mattered more was whether these individuals would use their newfound understanding to prevent similar harm in the future. Maya had interviewed several of the reformed content creators for an article she was writing about digital responsibility and age discrimination. Their stories followed similar patterns: initial participation in harassment campaigns driven by social media algorithms and peer pressure, gradual realization of the human cost of their actions, and eventual commitment to using their platforms more responsibly. The problem isn't just individual cruelty, Maya had explained to me after completing her interviews. It's a system that rewards engagement over empathy, that treats real people like content opportunities, that encourages young people to build their careers by tearing down others. Her observation reminded me that our victory over Pinnacle, while satisfying, was just one battle in a much larger war about how power operates in modern society, about who gets to determine community values, and about whether corporations can use social media manipulation to achieve goals they couldn't accomplish through legitimate business practices. The afternoon brought another visitor, this one considerably more welcome than Chloe had. Danny, my nephew who'd provided crucial technical expertise during our investigation, had driven down from Seattle to visit and to discuss a new project he was working on. "Aunt Beulah," he said, giving me the kind of hug that reminded me why family relationships mattered so much. "You look fantastic. Retirement suits you." I laughed. "I'm not retired, I'm just diversified." Danny had taken a sabbatical from his cybersecurity job to work on developing digital tools that could help communities document and resist corporate harassment campaigns. The software he was creating would make it easier for small business owners to collect evidence, organize coalitions, and connect with legal resources when they faced pressure from powerful interests. "Your case showed us that ordinary people can build federal quality investigations if they have the right tools and know what to look for," he explained, as we sat in my apartment kitchen, the same table where I'd first started planning our resistance strategy. "But most people don't have the advantages you had: the business experience, the network of connections, the patience to document everything methodically." His software would essentially democratize the investigative process, providing templates for evidence collection, automated systems for organizing documentation, and secure platforms for sharing information with legal experts and federal investigators. "We're calling it Community Shield," Danny said, showing me the prototype on his laptop. "It's designed specifically for situations like yours, where individuals or small groups are being targeted by organizations with significant resources." I watched him demonstrate the software's capabilities, marveling at how technology could be used to level playing fields that had historically favored powerful interests over ordinary citizens. The same digital tools that corporations used to coordinate harassment campaigns could be turned around and used by communities to defend themselves. But the most innovative feature was the network component, which would allow users to share information about corporate tactics across different communities. If a development company that had used harassment strategies in one city tried similar tactics elsewhere, community organizers would be able to access information about their methods and prepare appropriate responses. "You've created a way for communities to learn from each other's experiences," I said, immediately grasping the implications. "Companies like Pinnacle won't be able to rely on their targets being isolated and uninformed." Danny nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. And we're partnering with legal organizations, to provide pro bono support for communities that document corporate harassment using the platform. The goal is to make these kinds of pressure campaigns too risky and expensive for companies to attempt. As we discussed the technical details and potential applications, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction that our experience was contributing to tools that could help other communities avoid similar harassment or fight back more effectively if they faced it. The evening news that night featured a segment about corporate accountability that included a brief update on our story. The reporter mentioned that Pinnacle Urban Development's former executives were still facing civil lawsuits from property owners in 3 other cities, and that the federal task force created in response to our case had opened investigations into 4 additional development companies suspected of using similar intimidation tactics. Watching that segment, I reflected on how much had changed since those dark months when I'd felt isolated and powerless against an apparently coordinated campaign to destroy my reputation and force me out of my community. The woman who'd been mocked as outdated and irrelevant had become a symbol of effective resistance against corporate bullying. The store that had been portrayed as a relic from the past had become a model for community-centered business practices. The neighborhood that developers had tried to improve through harassment and intimidation had instead strengthened its identity and solidarity. But perhaps the most important change was personal. I discovered capabilities I hadn't known I possessed, found allies I hadn't expected, and learned that age could be a source of power rather than vulnerability if approached with the right strategy and mindset. The young content creators who'd initially targeted me had taught me something valuable, though not intentionally, that being underestimated was only a disadvantage if you accepted other people's assessments of your capability. I'd spent too many years apologizing for taking up space, deferring to louder voices, assuming that my age and quiet nature made me less relevant to modern conversation. The harassment campaign had forced me to choose between accepting that diminished role or fighting for my right to exist fully in my own community. Choosing to fight had revealed strengths I'd forgotten I had, and capabilities I'd never properly developed. It had also connected me to a network of people who valued experience, wisdom, and the kind of persistent determination that comes from decades of solving problems and overcoming obstacles. As I prepared for bed that night, I walked through my store one final time, checking locks and turning off lights. The familiar routine felt both comforting and significant, a reminder that some things endured not because they were old-fashioned, but because they served purposes that transcended temporary trends and corporate profit margins. My store would continue serving this community long after the last content creator had moved on to new trends and the last development company had learned that harassment was more expensive than honest negotiation. It would continue because it met real needs, built genuine relationships, and contributed to the kind of social fabric that made neighborhoods into communities. Standing in my darkened store, surrounded by the products and memories that represented 37 years of serving my neighbor, I smiled at the thought of David Kellner sitting in his prison cell, those many months, probably wondering how an elderly grocery store owner had managed to destroy his career and his company's entire business model. The answer was simple, though he'd likely never understand it. He'd assumed that power came from money, influence, and the ability to intimidate others, but real power came from understanding your community, building authentic relationships, and having the patience to outlast opponents who mistook loudness for strength. I'd spent decades developing that kind of power without realizing it, accumulating advantages that only became visible when I finally decided to use them. The content creators and development executives who'd targeted me had seen only the surface, an elderly woman in comfortable clothes running a small store. They'd missed the network of relationships I'd built over decades, the financial resources I'd quietly accumulated, the legal knowledge I'd acquired through years of property ownership, and the community connections that gave me access to expertise and support they couldn't match. Most importantly, they'd missed the determination that comes from finally deciding you're tired of being pushed around by people who think your age makes you powerless. The last light in my store went out, and I climbed the stairs to my apartment, leaving behind another day in a life that had become far more interesting and influential than I'd ever imagined possible. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to help other communities resist corporate intimidation, new chances to prove that being underestimated could be the greatest advantage of all for someone who knew how to use it properly. The young content creators who'd started this entire chain of events had tried to make me into a symbol of everything outdated and irrelevant about my generation. Instead, they'd helped me become a symbol of everything powerful and enduring about the wisdom that comes with age, experience, and the refusal to let others define your worth. They'd wanted to make me feel small and powerless. Instead, they'd reminded me that a determined woman with decades of experience could be the most formidable opponent imaginable, especially when she stopped apologizing for existing and started fighting for her right to thrive. And as I settled into sleep in the apartment above the store that had become the center of a national conversation about corporate accountability and community resistance, I smiled at the perfect irony of it all. The people who'd tried to make me disappear had instead made me impossible to ignore. They'd thought they were dealing with just another elderly victim who would quietly accept whatever treatment they decided to dish out. Instead, they'd awakened something in me that I hadn't even known was there, the absolute refusal to let anyone, no matter how young or well-funded or technologically sophisticated, treat me as anything less than the formidable woman I'd always been capable of becoming. The content creators who'd mocked my age had learned too late that age, when combined with experience, resources, and determination, could be the most powerful weapon of all. And their credit scores, along with their careers and their freedom, had aged into ancient history as a direct result of underestimating exactly the wrong woman at exactly the wrong time. They'd tried to make me feel like a relic from the past. Instead, they'd helped me become a blueprint for the future of community resistance against corporate intimidation. And that, I reflected as sleep finally came, was a legacy worth leaving behind. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.